Dr. Leor Zmigrod is a political psychologist and neuroscientist and author of The Ideological Brain, which does something astonishing. It connects extremism and immersion in rigid ideologies with our brains and bodies. Her research centers on what psychological and neurobiological traits make some individuals more susceptible to extreme ideologies and the harms that ideologies pose to individuals' cognitive freedom. She studied at Cambridge University as a Gates Scholar before winning a junior research fellowship at Churchill College in Cambridge. She has held visiting fellowships at Stanford, Harvard, and both the Berlin and Paris Institutes for Advanced Study. And she was listed on Forbes 30 Under 30 in science and has won numerous prizes, including the Women of the Future of Science Award and the Glushko Prize for Cognitive Science Research. So we're very happy to have you here. We'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for the welcome. I gave a chapter, it was chapter 3, so it's not the beginning of the book, but it's before all the exciting science comes. But I thought it would be a good one for our conversation because I'll talk for a while, I'll present some ideas, some new science that maybe you haven't come across before, some things that might resonate, other things that might be challenging, and that's all for the purpose of us having a really fruitful conversation. Um, but things I'll be talking about, if you read the chapter, it'll resonate in another way, but it's okay if you haven't. And basically, the book that I wrote, the Ideological Brain, that you have in the American copy, which is now been excitingly being translated into nearly 20 languages. So it's become quite a global book and audience, which is awesome. But really, what the book looks at is this question of why does a person get swept up in an ideology that might be extreme, that might be violent, that might be really dogmatic? What is it about a person that might predispose them to think in that kind of extreme, rigid, intolerant way? And to answer that question, I've kind of marshaled some unlikely sources of evidence from the brain sciences, from experimental psychology, also from history and sociology and all those other fields. But importantly, I really care about the brain. I really felt when I started doing this research about a decade ago that when we were talking about explaining why does someone commit an act of violence against someone else in the name of an ideology, the explanations that we gave were really social. They were very much external. It was about the moment in history that a person is in, the environment that they're in, maybe some characteristics about where they come from or where they grew up or their age. Maybe they were so young and foolish, or, all these external characteristics about a person. But I felt really strongly that those explanations were lacking, that when we look at a community of people, there are some people in that community who, even if they all experience very similar environments, similar social pressures, similar kinds of stresses, some people will kind of cling on to an ideology in an extreme and potentially violent way, and other people won't. So there's huge variation between us in terms of who is most susceptible and who isn't. And I felt like psychology and the brain had a lot to do with kind of affecting who is most at risk for thinking in a closed and violent way and who isn't. And so that's why I set out to study this experimentally, to conduct these experiments, which I've now done with thousands of people from around the world, to really assess who tends to think in a closed, violent, dogmatic way about the world and who doesn't. And the reason that kind of zooming into the brain, zooming into personality, into the person matters is because, like the chapter also starts to kind of discuss, we have really relied on these situational social explanations of people's ideological behavior. And I'm not saying that all those situational social factors aren't there. Of course they are there, and of course they are pronounced. But what I'm interested in is why do they affect some people so much more than they affect others? right? Not everyone, when an authoritarian regime comes along, not everyone will run towards it and embrace its rigid rules and identities with equal passion. Some people will be really resistant, right? So I felt like the situational explanations alone, without thinking about the brain and psychology, were insufficient. And in the chapter, I also highlight how many of you might have heard of those famous social psychology experiments, the Milgram electrocution experiments, the Zimbardo Stanford experiment. Those are things we're really familiar with. And they're often, the conclusion is, okay, we're all prone to obedience, to blind conformity, to a kind of passivity when we are in a really terrible situation. But what we've forgotten from those studies is that actually there was a sizable minority that resisted, and that is a sizable minority that we need to consider. Because why? Why do some people have the capacity to resist, and what can we learn from those people? And so I felt like the way in which we explain 20th century atrocities and also the way in which we explain 21st century atrocities is very rooted in these situational explanations that are insufficient. And so when I started doing these experiments, I wanted to study what we call individual differences, differences between us. But the way I wanted to study them wasn't just by asking a lot of people to tell me about themselves, because we are actually not very good at knowing what our personality is fully like, what our brains are really like, which is why I've used these methods that tap into unconscious processes in human cognition and psychology. And so what I have done is I have done these experiments where I invite thousands of people from around the world to play what we call neuropsychological tasks. These are actually, they look like games. So if some of you like to play solitaire or Tetris or Minesweeper or all these things that we like to play on our computers or our phones, we have games like this that are similar, but are actually psychological tests that allow us to really measure how a person's brain works, right? How do they solve problems? How do they solve puzzles? How do they respond when there's moments of change or uncertainty in a game? And by giving people these kinds of games, first of all, they're fun to play. So, if I gave them to you to play, you would probably enjoy your time, which is good. When you do experiments, you don't want people bored. Um, but more importantly, you don't know what it is that I'm measuring because you're playing a game. And what's been powerful about giving these games that have been specifically designed to measure psychological and cognitive function is they have brought kind of results that we would have never seen if we just asked people to tell us about their conscious personality. And so I'll tell you a little bit about some of the findings that I've found and how I think that relates to our understanding. And because this whole course and institute is dedicated to the question of how do we prevent violence now, I'll also touch on the moment, the today, and why these things are important today in new ways that are different to what they were like in the 20th century. So I'll give you a kind of experiment that I've done with many people, which is I have looked at a characteristic called cognitive rigidity. And a person who is cognitively rigid tends to see the world in really black and white terms. So they see it in a really binary way. And whenever there's a change or uncertainty, they will really struggle to adapt. So rather than switching their behavior or responding to change or new evidence, they'll resist. Now, if I just asked you here, all of us here today, do you think that you tend to be a rigid person? Very few of you would probably tell me that you are, because we don't like necessarily to think of ourselves as rigid people. But surely, out of everyone here, there's kind of a natural distribution. Some of us are more flexible thinkers, others more rigid thinkers. Most of us are somewhere in between alongside this spectrum. And so, and so I have done these kinds of, given people these kinds of games that allow me to put them on that spectrum from the most rigid thinker to the most flexible one. And the games look like the ones I mentioned, Tetris, Solitaire. There's one that's maybe the most easy to describe, which is a kind of imagination game. And what I do is I ask people to spend a few minutes looking at an everyday object. That object could be a newspaper, a paper clip, could be a glass. And I ask them, okay, take 2 minutes and tell me all the possible ways you could imagine using a glass. Take 2 minutes. Your ideas can be avant-garde, they could be super boring. I don't care. Just spend 2 minutes writing them down. Don't worry, you don't have to do this because I can tell you that most people will often say you can drink water like I am right now. They'll say, you can drink coffee, a hot beverage, you can drink Coke, you can drink Fanta. They'll spend 2 minutes writing all the things that you could drink from a glass. And so they might be very intelligent. They'll have many, many ideas, whiskey, champagne, all kinds of ideas. But as you can see, they're sticking to one track, right? Their mind is sticking to the most conventional use, which is to use a glass to drink something. And they're just iterating on that, just thinking of different versions of that idea. But so those people tend to be more cognitively rigid thinkers, potentially very intelligent, but rigid in the way in which they think. But another person might say, yes, you can drink Fanta or Coke from your glass, but you can use it also as a toothbrush holder, right? Or you can use it to plant a little flower. Or, you can use it as you can tip it over and use it as a makeshift golf kind of hole. So you can start to see that this person might have given me the same number of ideas as the first person, but their mind has gone in many different directions. They're giving me many diverse ideas that you can see that in those 2 minutes I've asked them to play this kind of imagination game, their mind has switched between different ideas. They've thought how you could use what you could put inside it, what you can put on top of it, how you can flip it. They have taken that object and turned it around in many different ways. And that's a more flexible thinker. And so flexibility is not intelligence. It's a particular way of approaching life, thoughts, problems. And what I've done when I've given these types of cognitive flexibility games to many people is I found that those map on very closely to the way in which people think about ideologies and about the political world. So I found that the people who are most rigid in this kind of game tend to be the most ideological. They're the most dogmatic. They resist evidence or different perspectives. They don't want to hear different opinions. They like the way they think. And they are also going to be the most violent. They're most supportive of violence. So they support ideological violence in the name of their cause. They think it's legitimate to harm someone else who threatens or disagrees with their beliefs. They think it's even okay to harm themselves, to sacrifice their life in the name of that cause. So we see that the most rigid thinkers are the ones that also support a kind of martyrdom of like, I will die in the name of my ideology, of my group. And interestingly, it doesn't actually matter what ideology I studied, whether it was politics and the extreme ends of it, whether it was nationalism, whether it was religion, whether it was any kind of ideology, the most cognitively rigid minds were the most ideologically rigid and the most ideologically extreme and willing to commit acts of violence in the name of their ideologies. And this was true regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of educational background, regardless of all those demographic factors that we often turn to explain people's politics or their beliefs. It was actually these internal psychological factors that were hugely predictive for who was going to be the kind of ideological warrior and who was really going to resist those violent solutions. And so that really starts to challenge how we've been viewing the roots of violence, because suddenly they become a lot more individual. And that can feel quite uncomfortable, right? Because there's something to some extent, not necessarily comfortable, but easier to swallow when you're saying, okay, it's history, it's our environments, it's things outside of us rather than something within us. That's just like suddenly you have to reckon with potential responsibility, potential blame, like potential susceptibility or vulnerability that you might have that you might not want to think that you do. But it's actually really important that we recognize that those sources can be psychological because it helps us think about how we can resist, right? How we can prevent violence in ourselves and in others. Because actually, although we've painted that there's a spectrum from the most rigid thinker to the most flexible thinker and everybody in between, you can actually shift your position on that spectrum. So people can become more flexible thinkers and people can become more rigid thinkers. And we know that's true because even in our own lives, right, when we suddenly become stressed, if suddenly there was a pandemic or there was a stressful moment, a bear came into the room, suddenly you would become a lot more rigid. You would become focused, you don't want alternative perspectives, and you will become a lot more inflexible in the way in which you think and perceive and approach the world. And we see that in the results. We see that when we stress people out, even in an hour, we make someone more stressed, suddenly, even our most flexible thinker will become quite rigid and quite dogmatic in the way they approach and solve any kind of problem. So that gets you to think about how, well, different when there's an environment of stress or an environment where suddenly violence is endorsed, the people who are most cognitively rigid will kind of, those traits will become more accentuated, more expressed, and they'll be a lot more vulnerable than someone who was more flexible at the beginning. But all of us are susceptible, right? No one is immune. And that's what we have to recognize because sometimes we think, okay, it's a certain culture that, accepts violence, not our culture, or, it's a certain kind of person, not my kind of person. But actually, the potential exists in all of us. And so that's why we kind of need to think, well, okay, if we want to prevent violence or help our students or our children or our grandchildren not have violent attitudes towards life, how do we cultivate their cognitive flexibility? Because once you cultivate that cognitive flexibility in all things, you can become a more tolerant person who can accept evidence, who can accept alternative perspectives. That doesn't mean that you're now persuadable by any new idea that comes along, because flexibility can be a solid state, right? It can be a strength. It doesn't have to be that you have a kind of weakness that anyone can change your mind. It's that you can evaluate evidence, you can evaluate the humanness of other people and consider it carefully and consider it rationally. So that's why in a lot of my work and what I talk about in the book is both starting from kind of these findings about cognitive rigidity and flexibility and how they relate to our politics and ideologies and all of that. I go more into the body and to show how really there are brain differences between people who are most dogmatic and violent and those who are not. There are differences in our physiology, even our genetics. There are all these environmental triggers that can affect which path we take, how our environments affect us, and ultimately thinking about, yeah, how do we cultivate that flexibility so that we protect ourselves, right? Because progress, human society is not linear. It doesn't go one way of just towards peace. Maybe it is becoming generally more peaceful, but as the news shows today, it is completely not linear. We have to work to make peace a more sustainable thing. And I said that I would also touch about why it's important to do this now, as in the title of this educational institute, because although I don't know if there are any like millennials and Gen Zs here today, many of us have contact with younger people, and we know that the way in which they consume information is primarily online and not in the way that it used to be. It's not just online um, like mainstream news agents, it's through social media algorithms that are designed to not only create these echo chambers, but really to give you the most rigid information, right? It's the most black and white binary information. It's the information that will arouse your emotions in the strongest way, right? These algorithms, when I looked at them and I looked at all the characteristics I discovered make people vulnerable to extremism and violence, I was like, there's an exact match. Because these characteristics of rigidity, of all these emotional characteristics I found as well, are exactly the ones that social media algorithms are designed to amplify. And we do see that now actually violence is being normalized for many young people. I work with a lot of policymakers and people who work with young people who are at risk for radicalization, both in the US and in the UK. And what's most striking is that the age at which people are now being referred to services for risk of radicalization is dropping dramatically, right? 10 years ago, yes, you had maybe 16-year-olds who, in that kind of stage of adolescence would get enamored by some kind of radical ideology and be referred for kind of these services. But now the age is dropping to 12 and 11. That is shocking. Those are real children who are hugely at risk of these kind of really malicious types of influence. And so the landscape is changing. And I think that when we look at how AI is changing that further, that's even one step. And I don't mean to fearmonger or talk about only how negative the picture is, but it is genuinely a very dangerous situation because whereas with social media algorithms, they're already designed to kind of, in many ways, bring out the most dogmatic in the viewer, the consumer. AI chatbots are going to have those conversations that are personalized to you. And if the AI, now we trust AI generally, we think that it is kind of a source of expertise and facts and reliable in many ways. But the second the AI chatbots become more ideologically influenced, then the conversations that they have with young people, with anyone, could really be radicalizing conversations. And that is now a lot more impactful than just, okay, watching content to persuade you. It is having a conversation directly with you. And that's why there's now research showing how, whereas 20 years ago, it would take about a year and a half to radicalize someone. That would be about how long you would need to be involved with people in a certain community to get truly brainwashed and radicalized. Now you can do that in a matter of days. It's the timeline and speed and kind of power of these forces is really shocking. And so I think there's never been a more urgent time to think about how do we nurture psychological resilience? How do we do that in young people, in ourselves, to make sure that these ideologies don't grasp us so easily? And the reason that a lot of my research really focus on how people think and believe rather than what they believe, that's because I think new ideologies will come along, right? New forms will continuously pop up and justify a different kind of violence. We need to be prepared to face that dogmatism and rigidity and the permissiveness of violence in whatever form it comes, whether it's from the far right or far left or nationalistic or globalist movement, whatever form it takes, we need to have that kind of psychological preparedness. And the good thing is, I'll end with a hopeful note to a slightly dark end, is that there is a lot that we can do because unlike we can't change the currents of history or huge cultural movements, but we can affect ourselves. We can choose what kind of brains we want to have, to nurture, what kind of thinking styles we want to adopt, to encourage in our students and children. And so there's actually a lot that as individuals we can do in order to protect ourselves and the people that we care about from these pernicious influences. So psychology can give us a sense of responsibility, but I think that can be really empowering.